As promised in a recent video, let's focus on the heart-shaped symbol punched into many, but not most, antique tomahawks and see where else in the world that kind of thing is present, and because it does show up in other cultures. And do any of those analogous cases explain how it ended up in North America on certain tomahawks? Now, I got on to investigating this because of this video here from my channel that you see at the top. I held an antique tomahawk that I think is the first one I've ever inspected in person with that symbol in it. And as you can see in the video title, you call them weeping heart or bleeding heart tomahawks. And yes, either one is a really awesome name for a weapon. As we investigate our case, one thing to understand is that we don't have to concern ourselves with the entire history of Native American tomahawks, and just the metal-headed variety, which only started after colonization began. Because before that, or until then, tomahawks were made by the indigenous people of the North American continent out of materials like stone. This is a modern recreation one. Of course, the coolest version would be the animal jawbone tomahawk. This, of course, also a modern recreation. But yeah, the heart-shaped hole punched into a Native American weapon, carved whatever, does not seem to be a thing, from what I could tell anyway, until contact was made with Europeans. And so we're going to operate under the assumption that it's an imported symbol, which is fine, that happens. And the opposite scenario being parallel development, like with the what we would call swastika. I know I've used this example before on my channel, but that Native American beadwork uses a symbol that was invented in the Americas and happens to look exactly like the same symbol from the other side of the world. That's a thumbnail from one of my other videos if you want to check that one out. Okay, so it's imported, our heart symbol, and we're fairly certain. But where is it imported from? Like I mentioned a minute ago, this kind of thing exists in more than one place throughout the world. In Eurasia, it can be seen in Libya. It was used in ancient Persia, things like this here, and of course these greatly predate European contact with the Americas. I mean by, half a millennium more. If we focus on India, it's more like 1,000 years before. But whatever gave anybody the idea to draw this shape, draw or carve, like where did the inspiration come from? Well, it seems pretty clear it came from the plant world. We're told the linden leaf, L-I-N-D-E-N, was the inspiration. And you can see that here. And I just read this kind of offhand comment that, the heart shape comes from the linden leaf, which was an important symbol in Europe, and that was about it. So I was looking for more information. How about this? From the Journal of Horticulture, Forestry and Biotechnology, so seems pretty serious. The Symbolism of the Linden Tree is the name of the article. And jump down. Between the trees of the Romanian mythology that were invested by the tradition with special virtues, the beech, the fir, the locust, the walnut, the apple, there is also the holy linden tree. It symbolizes divine presence. It's a sacred tree, an element that accompanies various rituals, a symbol of life and death. Interesting, but we know the heart symbol in Europe came to symbolize love, so where's that from? Further in the same article, according to Greek legends, the linden tree was a symbol of marital love. Due to the perfume of its flowers, linden trees became, in the Greek mythology, the sacred tree of Aphrodite. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Linked to the goddess of love in the mythology that would greatly influence Roman mythology, which would greatly influence all of Europe. Okay. By the way, who says it had to be one type of leaf, though? Because I took this picture here in Dallas, Texas, just the other day. And this is not a linden tree, at least from what I read. They don't grow in this part of Texas. But this looks way more like a heart than the actual linden tree leaf I showed before. And look at these. Look at all these hearts. In the same spot, of course. So yeah, all I had to do was look around the place I happen to live in to prove this shape is found in nature. And then there's the question of why did this shape come to symbolize our hearts? And the actual organ looks nothing like it. But as we can see here and in many other examples of ancient art in the West, the shape became associated with love and our hearts. This is a real chicken and the egg thing though, right? I forget, by the way, why this man is dropping his heart or somebody else's heart off in that receptacle or flower, but anyway. The shape can be found in nature, but did we first, meaning people in Europe or around there, first associate it with the organ and then we associated the organ with the emotion, with love, or was it some other sequence? And did we associate the shape with the emotion and then the emotion with the organ and thereby transfer that shape symbol to the organ? Don't know, but what we do know for sure is that this symbol, the shape, came to represent both love and the human heart by, let's say, the Middle Ages. I'm looking at my notes, late Middle Ages, and really became popular in like the 1500s. And you can see them on coats of arms. And a couple centuries later, 1500s, in playing cards. Like these from the early 1500s. So it's not hard to see how, it was around and somebody in Europe might decide to stamp it onto a weapon, just like weapons were decorated with all kinds of common motifs. But there's one crucial piece missing, and that is religion. And we're looking at an ancient representation of the wounds of Jesus. Jesus was run through with a lance in the side, and somehow it became common in Catholic art to portray that as him getting pierced through the heart. And that might seem difficult to imagine making that connection, but it's this kind of thing that we're seeing here. And this is part of what became known in the church as a devotion. It was a devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And that had been a thing for a while, but it really only became popular in the late 1600s. And that's because a French nun said she had visions and received instructions straight from Christ. Regardless, the heart symbol shape, which was already associated with love, then becomes associated with Christ and his love. And think about the timeline here. All of this is coming together right around the same time, roughly, that the Americas are getting colonized. And so you have what is to some a religious symbol, but also just a well-known cultural symbol, and it ends up getting put on weapons that end up getting brought over to the New World. What kind of weapons? Well, the same kind you were using in Europe. For instance, here's a period sword that certainly could have been brought over. I'm not saying it was. It's definitely the kind of thing that could have been brought over. Okay, I'm heading on over to the New World, taking this sword, and look what we have on the basket hilt. A line of hearts, and importantly, punched through the metal, because that's what we end up seeing on Tomahawks. Here's a sword I saw in person. This is from the 1684 French La Salle expedition to what is now Texas. And you can see, even though it's a different sword type, it's from the overall same point in sword development. And I don't think it's difficult to imagine Native Americans in the Southwest, what would later be United States, seeing this shape here, or the same in the last sword, and saying, well, I'd like to see that in one of these awesome metal tomahawks that we get made for us now, because of our trade with Europeans. In fact, look how similar that heart shape is to the one from the tomahawk that started off our video. I read everything I could on this subject, of course, and I think this might be the first time someone's pointing out that a swept hilt rapier could have been the original inspiration. And basket hilts are normally what gets talked about, and that makes sense, because there was probably a lot more like the one we saw last time, or this one here. And basket hilts are probably what some of you thought of right away when we talked about, where in Europe the inspiration for the tomahawk design might have come from. But generally we think of more elaborate ones like this, because it's not uncommon to see that shape punched through, especially on Scottish basket hilts like this. So you can tell this is a further elaboration, a little bit later in time, probably, I'm not a sword expert, than the last two we saw. So I like those because it shows that what we're keying in on here, that heart shape, was around for a while, and coincides with the colonial era. Here's an old portrait of a Scotsman, and we can see the heart shape multiple times on the sword. But look right above it, and you'll see a much bigger heart on his baldric, which just goes to prove what's probably pretty obvious. It doesn't have to be that this symbol transference happened from weapon to weapon, although I do think that's most likely. And also, as far as possible theories, I found an uncorroborated comment stating that the heart was the symbol of the New England Trading Company. Back to swords in general, European swords, here's some intel from people who know way more about sword history than I do. North European Dusage, D-U-S-S-A-G-E, the basket hilt sabers believed to have been used by Scottish mercenaries and often mistakenly termed Sinclair sabers, often had heart-shaped cutouts in the guard panels. I think this sword from earlier in the video counts as one of those. Meanwhile, in that same internet discussion, I didn't keep in my notes which site, sorry. Might have been vikingsword.com. Anyway, in that same discussion, they said Austro-Hungarian sabers and Polish armor could feature the heart shape, which is probably true because, again, it was a well-known, well-used symbol. Which takes us all the way back to religion. Catholicism, like we talked about earlier, and the devotion to the Sacred Heart, that probably explains the popularity of this symbol on certain kinds of swords. And yes, this ancient drawing here is once again showing the piercing of the heart of Jesus' heart by the lance. It's pretty unconventional in how it does that. To really fine-tune the point about the heart as a religious symbol, keep in mind, one, Jesus' heart became an important symbol, and therefore we can imagine how it got used on weapons. But as I point out with some of these old illustrations, his heart getting pierced became an artistic convention, and it's interesting that the heart shape is pierced into the guards of the swords that we saw. And anyway, I said we were back to religion because it's warriors coming from places where Catholicism was predominant and that were likely to have hearts on their swords, so that includes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because it was predominantly Catholic, and also the guys we're looking at here, the Scottish Jacobites, so back to the Scots, because Jacobitism was a movement to restore the Catholic House of Stuart to the British monarchy. And it existed in different pockets of Britain, not just Scotland. And the movement we're talking about started up in the late 17th century, so perfect on the Venn diagram with everything else we're talking about, the early colonial era. By the way, here's proof that it wasn't just Jesus' heart that was portrayed in art as being pierced. And that really is the end of the European and predominant hypothesis on how the heart shape showed up on Tomahawks. But there is an alternate, much less likely but worth checking in on. It's also worth covering because we're basically now in the video tracing out all the predominant instances, the really notable instances of this shape showing up punched through weapons throughout the world. Which takes us to Japan, where really awesome axes like this were made. Now, I used this picture in my video on an antique weeping tomahawk that I actually held, and I just grabbed this to show, okay, yeah, here's something like a tomahawk, an axe-type weapon, even if ceremonial, with that shape. And anyway, I had no idea it was Japanese. A couple of viewers pointed that out. So what are we looking at here? Well, this symbol, in Japan, its name translates as Eye of a Wild Boar. The word is inome, I-N-O-M-E, and you can see it in different Shinto and Buddhist decorations, shrines, temples, and of course ceremonial weapons like this one here. So this, by the way, is a ritual mountaineering axe. So I'm going to quote from the site emuseum.com. Used to be a practical tool for Yamabushi, who would use it to cut through branches and clear the brush in their path. It later became formalized and was also used as a piece of ritual implement. End quote, and this specimen is from the 14th century. Yamabushi, by the way, are mountain monks / priests. So here's an axe of the type in question being used ceremonially. But in terms of Japanese weapons, you don't just see them on axes. You also don't just see them on decorative weapons. I think, the axe, this one here, this next picture, they're probably weapons that are meant more to be seen than used, but there is a definite tradition in Japan of putting this symbol on a functional part of a functional weapon. And that is on sword guards. So you might look at the tsuba of an old katana and see what we would think of as a heart shape. And we're full circle back to the European tradition of doing the same thing. Isn't that interesting? Now, the thing is, of course, this is a completely different symbol. This is absolutely a case of parallel development, because remember, this is the Japanese Eye of the Wild Boar symbol, not the European lovey-dovey heart and or heart of the Christian god or his mother. This here is a protective symbol that's supposed to evoke the fierceness of a provoked boar, and it's meant to ward off evil spirits. And it was used on Japanese sword guards and other weapons since long before Europeans started colonizing the Americas, almost 1,000 years before. So the remaining question is there a chance this particular symbol is actually what inspired the tomahawk design? Well, it's at least possible. The hypothesis would, of course, be that somehow one of these objects made it to the Americas, and that could have been via Europe, right? Portugal and Japan started trading in the mid 16th century. So theoretically, somebody, Portuguese or not, trades for a sword or something with that shape punched through it, comes back to Europe, and it somehow ends up in the New World. And that design ends up getting tried out on a Tomahawk, and it turns out that people like it. By the way, something we should mention, just because it's possible, whether Western or Eastern, origin theory, either one, maybe the first person to try this design was in Europe and just tried it like, I wonder if they'll like this, and then it caught on once it was taken over, as opposed to the symbol being noticed by Native Americans in America. And now you will notice that we are looking at a picture of a Native American holding a Japanese sword. And so there's evidence of Japanese weaponry making it to the Native American population, but this picture is from like the late 19th century. I think I'll do a separate video on the story behind this picture, but regardless, for every one Japanese sword that made it to the New World, as you can imagine, there were countless European ones that did. Okay, that might actually be it for this video. As the title advertised, a ridiculously in-depth look at the question of how certain Tomahawks came to have a heart shape in the blade. Thanks.